Now, this evening we are continuing our series looking at church history, and we're taking on a massive 800 years this evening, from the 4th through to the end of the 11th century. And when you look at it, it looks, well, there's not much that really kind of takes place, but actually there's a lot that takes place. So we'll try and get through as much as we can. There's an awful lot, obviously, that we're going to leave out. Now, back in our first session, we looked at just a mere 300 years from Pentecost onwards, and I want to just begin by recapping on some of the things that we saw. Firstly, we saw how perfectly everything had been set up so that Christianity could spread swiftly throughout the Roman Empire. So Pompey the Great, he had cleared the pirates in the Mediterranean, and he had made the seas safe. And across the empire, the Roman army had built those wonderful, amazing Roman roads, so that for the first time in history, people could travel easily and at high speed around those lands. Also, we saw that thanks to the Greeks, everyone in Palestine, the Holy Land, spoke Greek, which could be understood by pretty well everyone throughout the empire, as opposed to their native language of Aramaic, which nobody else spoke. And finally, we saw that thanks to the Romans' superstitious nature, there was general religious tolerance in the empire as well. So the result of this was that under the apostles and the guys who succeeded them, the apostolic fathers, Christianity spread quickly across the empire. And as it did so, however, we saw the church then began to suffer increasing persecution at the hands of the Romans. Not because the Romans were intolerant of the religion, but because they found their practices unpatriotic, because the Christians didn't join in with the pagan festivals and often offer sacrifices to the emperors. Potentially rebellious, because the church contained so many slaves and women, and if you're doing that, clearly you're stirring up some kind of rabble. And also because their love feasts, as they call them, were obviously orgies, and they engaged in cannibalism, eating the flesh and blood of some guy called Jesus. So as a result, they persecuted them. And in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, we saw that the apologists rose up to defend Christianity from these charges. They also defended the church from heresy as well, formulating, as we saw, the Apostles' Creed as a statement of faith for the churches. Unfortunately, this actually did little to prevent the increasing persecution that the church suffered. And by the middle of the 3rd century, Christians were actively hunted down throughout the whole Roman Empire. And the worst persecution of all was from 303 to 306 AD under Emperor Diocletian. And it was only a few short years, but actually thousands upon thousands of Christians were tortured, their property confiscated, their families put to death, their Christian writings burned, and themselves martyred in the most horrific means that the Romans could come up with and invent. And so, happily, thus ended our first session. In 306 then, we'll continue. In 306, a new emperor came to the throne. His name was Constantine. He's this guy. And he really was made out of iron, or whatever that's made out of. Now, there was nothing about Constantine that suggested his reign would be any different from that of his predecessors. He was just another pagan guy. And yet, in 312, you'll see on your sheets, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, it said that he saw a cross in the sky, and he heard the words, "By this sign conquer." And when he was victorious, he declared himself to be a Christian. And the result was then the Edict of Milan. You'll see on there, 312, the Edict of Milan. Very important event, which on the face of it declared religious tolerance for Christians. But in reality, this favoured Christians above the pagan religions. And we start to see the tables turn. So no longer were Christians to be persecuted and oppressed. No longer were they to be looked down upon. Their houses were returned, their lands reinstated, and those who were exiled or imprisoned were released. Over time then, the status of Christianity in the Empire grew ever greater, thanks to the fact that Constantine and the emperors that succeeded him were Christians. And by around 380 AD, Christianity became the only official religion of Rome. There was even persecution then against those backward individuals who persisted in worshipping the old, now illegal, pagan gods. I mean, it's amazing that in just 70 years, Christianity went from them being hunted down and put to death to actually now, on the other side, they're elevated and the pagans are now being persecuted. Now, despite this, you look at this and think, wow, that's pretty sweet. But actually, there was something of a split in people's thinking as to whether or not this was actually a good thing. Some declared this to be clearly the will of God. Others thought this was a grave error. And just a couple of minutes, I want to open up, see what you think. What's your thoughts on whether or not this was a good thing? Let's start off with good. What might be good about Rome adopting Christianity as a state religion? Any thoughts? That Christianity could then spread faster, because it was no longer being quashed. Any other thoughts?
It gives it official recognition.
Why might that be a good thing?
Because it means more people are likely to follow the emperor.
Okay, So it becomes popular, and as well as being official, because the emperor is. You want to do what the emperor does, yeah. No thoughts on good things? They can meet freely, so without having to be persecuted and in fear of their lives, definitely. You're all thinking bad things instead, aren't you? So I'm coming to that. I'll just quickly give you some good ones. We've kind of touched on. The first one is that it was an end to the persecution of Christians, which is clearly a good thing. They didn't have to suffer anymore. They didn't have to hide away. They could meet freely and therefore spread the gospel more easily. And not only that, but just consider the huge barrier that persecution must have been to those hearing the gospel. I mean, today, people, there's a barrier between people coming to Christians because, what, have I got to go to church? Have I got to read the Bible and stuff and maybe live a bit differently? That's a barrier to people. Imagine how much greater a barrier it is to have the threat of being put to death for being a Christian. Become a Christian and be put to death. I mean, it's evangelism. But now, that's all changed. That threat has been removed. Another thing is that Christianity influenced the state. So the church could now make decisions about how things were run in the empire. And so they started passing laws that lived up to what they perceived as being Christian values, such as caring for the poor, and improving the status of women and slaves, and sorting out all kinds of other evils that there probably were in Roman society. And a third good thing is that people actually wanted to become Christians. As you say, it was popular, it was official. This was the thing to do. Being a Christian was the fashionable thing to do. And so all the high-class citizens were doing it. And as a result, actually, even those beyond the borders of the empire who looked in and they loved all the Roman things, they wanted to be like Rome, they also wanted to adopt Christianity because it was to be desired. So what about bad points? These are some good points. What bad points might have come about? Pardon? Complacency. Yeah. So kind of sort of wishy-washy Christianity, easy believers and that sort of stuff. Yeah. Forced conversions. Yeah. There's lots of that to come. Yeah. People being, because evangelism was done differently back then, as we'll see. Yeah, very much so. Yeah, so the emperor started to have say over what happened in the church. Yeah, very much. That becomes a big thing later as well. Any other thoughts? You mean just because? The emperor is one. I might as well become one because he is. Yeah, we'd probably think that was a wrong reason, wouldn't we? Yeah. Well, yeah, okay. Getting baptised and perceiving yourself to be a Christian, yeah.
Did the emperor have the ability to edit which Bible he wanted to promote?
No, though, and it was never allowed that sort of power, because by the time we get to Romanized Christianity or imperial Christianity, the canon's pretty well set. We'll see that in a bit. So they didn't have say over those sorts of things, no, despite what Dan Brown might say.
The church had too much influence in the further state.
Okay, yes.
Concerned with politics and with evangelism.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So getting too caught up in social things rather than. Yeah, okay, too caught up in power. Let me see what I've got. I've got, the church became powerful was my first one. It should go, whatever. The church became more powerful, by which I mean it had the full might of Rome was now at its, yes?
We said that basically being given power is also like sort of forced conversions.
Mm-hmm.
Persecuting pagans for their first, so they're basically supporting the words.
You mean by forcing people to become Christians? This is a different sort of gospel. Yeah. This is going to become very evident. Yeah, but also you do see through this that even though people are forced to become Christians, actually the result was that the belief kind of came with it as well somehow. We'll look at it when we get there. It's a bit of a weird setup. Because the church is powerful, disagreements over doctrine, for example, this can now be settled by force. Heretics can now be exiled, removed from the empire. And you might think, oh, that's a good thing, get rid of them. But actually this meant, of course, there's going to be some big power struggles going to happen. And sometimes the bad guys win. And this leaves the church open to massive corruption, potentially, as we'll see. Secondly, the state influenced Christianity. So just as Christianity kind of married with the state, it influenced the state, but it was also influenced itself in return. And the pagan style of worship in Rome started to influence the church, and all kinds of things crept in that shouldn't be there. From the worship of Mary and the saints to a very power-based leadership. And all kinds of other stuff in between, robes, etc., etc. I mean, much of it can still actually be seen in the church around the world today, even in this country, despite the work of the Puritans to get rid of it. Finally, the popularity of the church encouraged nominal Christianity. Because it was so popular, people were so keen to become Christians, even if they weren't actually interested in the faith or interested in God, they just got baptized and they're in. And so the narrow way to salvation has turned into this open road into the church with baptism rather than belief, now the kind of recognised mode of entry. There's often, in this country, a bewailing of the ongoing de-Christianisation of England, and a call to pray for our nation to be a Christian nation once again. But it is wise to consider the cons as well as the pros of these things, and actually be seeking God for what His will is in these situations. Either way, the more I look at the way that Christianity rose to power in the Roman Empire, the more I see God's hand in it. And remember, those two passages we began with the last time, Jesus' statement that we heard earlier, that I will build my church. It's a declaration of his intent. And also Gamaliel's comment as well in Acts, that if Christianity is of God, no one will be able to stop it. They would find themselves, in fact, fighting against God. And God was building his church. Rome had fought against God and lost. And now he was using the empire to spread the gospel even further. Here's a map from last time. This is where we got to at the end of the around the 300s or so. Christianity had spread to all these areas, about 10% of the population. And just after Christianity became official, the empire split into east and west, with the west in red, obviously, and the green being the east. And we're going to focus, by the way, on the West, because we've got enough church history to look at in the West, let alone trying to worry about other stuff. So that's what we're going to focus on for the rest of our sessions. But by this time, Christianity had expanded to cover both halves of the empire. There was nowhere in the empire that hadn't become influenced by Christianity and overrun by Christians. And as I said, thanks to the trade routes and people looking into the empire, wanting to know what's going on, actually it had spread even beyond the frontiers. Jerome, a guy who's in your timeline, he's the man who translated the Bible into the Latin Vulgate. He wrote this. He said, "From India to Britain, all nations resound with the death and resurrection of Christ." Now, as Christianity spread and the church grew in power, so too did the Bishop of Rome grow in status within the church, since Rome was the capital city. Now, back in the 1st century, a guy called Clement, who we did look at last time, one of the Apostolic Fathers, he claimed to have received the office of Bishop of Rome from the Apostle Peter himself. And Peter is believed to have been the first bishop of Rome. And since Jesus called Peter the rock on which he would build his church, and since Jesus promised to give him the keys to the kingdom, the bishops of Rome then claimed that they inherited what is known as Petrine authority. Pope Damasus I took for himself the title of the Roman high priest, or actually highest priest, the Pontifex Maximus. And this was certainly a claim to power. But also, this is a good guy. He convened the Council of Rome in 382, which is where they agreed the canon of Scripture. Just as an aside, one of the other great things about the end of persecution was that church leaders across the empire who had been split before, not able to travel that freely because of persecution, they could finally meet together to discuss doctrine and all this other stuff. And so a number of councils are called during this time. You'll see quite a few of them listed. There was, in 325, the Council of Nicaea, which built on the Apostles' Creed, as did the Council of Constantinople in 381, and they produced what is called the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, and we call it the Nicene Creed, much easier. And that's they formulated this as a statement of faith, and also to come against a number of heresies, such as the Arian heresy, which became very popular during this time. In 431, there was the Council of Ephesus, which tackled Nestorianism, another heresy, and to do with the two natures of Christ. And in 451, this was settled at the Council of Chalcedon, where they dealt with the two natures of Christ. And this actually resulted in a disagreement between the East and the West churches. And this was the first bit of a split, really, between these two churches. They were already quite naturally split into Greek-speaking, mostly Latin-speaking, and various East and West Empire. But this was the first doctrinal split where the East didn't really fully accept some of the teaching about the two natures of Christ. But we're not talking about them. It's worth noting that while the Council of Rome drew up the lists of the books of the Bible, it did not choose those books. It didn't sit there and go, what do you think of this one? No, it's rubbish. What about this one? Revelation. Let's put that in the maybe pile. There was none of that. They came together, and there was literally, what ones do your church have? What are you doing? Which ones are you reading? And actually, together they found they were all pretty well reading the same documents. And regardless of the list they produce, we have Bibles from before that council. So the Codex Sinaiticus is a copy of the complete Bible from around 330 to 350 AD. Some 50 years or so before the Council of Rome, and it contains all those books that are on that list, and no extras. Going back to the Bishop of Rome, Leo I, he stated that all bishops are equal, but one is more equal than the others. They are subject to the Bishop of Rome. After all, he is, I said, the bishop of the capital city. He's the emperor's bishop. Therefore, of course, he was the chief bishop. This makes sense. And so Leo was the first then to adopt this title, Pope, which means father. Other bishops would call him father, hence this Pope. So can you see how there's this gradual sort of claim by the popes to greater and greater authority? And this actually had much to do with the fact that Constantinople, you all heard of Constantinople? Yeah, this is a city that was founded by Constantine, surprisingly, as his new capital. And so that was raising up in the east, and you got Rome in the west, and they were vying. So they were politically kind of vying for power. And so naturally, the leaders of the church were also vying for headship. And that still remains today. You still have the Pope in... where is he? Rome, and the east. I'm not sure where they're headed up in the east these days, but it always used to be Constantinople. So but basically, the Bishop of Rome, Leo, wanted to make sure that the Pope got the final say in what happened in the church. It'll get worse later, but that's it so far. The opposite end of this spectrum, we have the monks. Now, these were the guys who did not welcome the popularity of Christianity. Back in the days of the persecution, some Christians hid out in the desert areas as hermits. Okay, the word monarchos, where we get the word monk from, just means solitary, mono, on your own. You look after yourself. There's a guy called Simon Stylites, in fact, this guy here. He was one such monk, and he decided to get right back to actual proper first century Christianity as Jesus intended by living in the desert on top of a 50-foot high pillar for 37 years. Awesome. That's what it's all about. It's not. Once the persecution ended, however, and Christianity became popular, many Christians fled from the cities to become monks in the desert, to escape the corruption of what they saw as nominal Christianity, but also as an alternative to the glory, as they saw it, of martyrdom. Suddenly, this had now been cruelly deprived. They'd been cruelly deprived of the opportunity to be martyred, so they would go and live in a way so as to suffer and to kind of almost earn the status of martyr by the way they lived. So many gathered in the desert that Pachomius, he formed the first monastic community in the Egyptian desert, probably as early as 320, so that's about 7 years after the Edict of Milan. He was visited by some guy I can't bother to talk to you about. Just pass over that. The church in the West was slower off the mark when it came to monasticism than the East. The East were very hot on it very early on. The West, they didn't. They put their first rule together really in the 6th century when St. Benedict built the first communal monastery in the West at Monte Cassino, just south of Rome in the 6th century. The rule of St. Benedict is 73 chapters long. Nice. And it includes guidance on who should be abbot, or who could be abbot, how much conversation was allowed to be had, the 8 hours of prayer, 8 hours every day, the details of the standard clothing, the division of labour and sleeping arrangement, the system of discipline, which included whipping for your stubborner monks, and even instructions on how to behave when going on a journey, because you're outside the confines, are very strict on how you should behave when you're out there. This rule was accepted by the Western Church and remained unaltered until the monastic reform in the 10th and 11th centuries. So then, we see in both the papacy and in the monasteries, there's this balance trying to be maintained between being in the world but not of the world. Could the popes maintain their Christian integrity whilst holding positions of such power and potential wealth? And on the other hand, could the monks still be of use in sort of the Christian mission to all nations when they lived in such small, strict communities. Now, one of the amazing things actually about the early monasteries was that they really did take their mission seriously, and they spent the majority of their time caring for the poor and the needy. And actually, when you look through the medieval missionaries, the vast majority were monks. The monasteries were also the ancient centres of learning in the ancient world, because it's long before the universities emerged. So that was the place to get your education, the monastery. And as a result, they received many benefactions, and so they amassed great amounts of land and wealth and power. And by the 8th century, because of this, they had become a byword for corruption and improper living. Before we move on, it is worth pointing out a few guys who had important roles during imperial Christianity, because we're about to leave that behind. Specific guys are Ambrose, who you see on there. He was instrumental in opposing Arianism. Jerome, who we've already mentioned, he was important. John Chrysostom, one of my favourites, who was an amazingly influential preacher in the East. And Augustine. If any of those, look at Augustine. He's arguably one of the greatest theologians the church has ever seen. He's up there with Aquinas and Calvin easily. And he taught actually very clearly on sanctification by faith alone through grace. And yet the church very quickly forgot what he wrote on those things. And it wasn't until Luther that they started to rediscover his writings. So Augustine, good lad. No sooner had Christianity taken a firm hold of the empire than Rome fell. And the legions had been stretched thinly around the enormous frontiers of the empire. And in 410, the Germanic tribe of the Visigoths broke through, and they got all the way to Italy and sacked Rome. And then they ran off again. Like naughty children. The Western Empire, though, it began to topple, and 66 years later it came crashing down, and the Roman power was overthrown with the death of the last Roman emperor. And this ushered in what is known as the Dark Ages, because these Germanic tribes had been desperate to take this empire for themselves for years. They flooded in from the north, all of them uneducated, unable to read and write and stuff. Hence the Dark Ages, because you don't have much records from these times. Here's a map showing the invasion of these tribes. It's a little bit complicated, but you'll see the... it's quite complicated. You've got guys like the Vandals, who went on some massive tour around Europe for a little joke, ended up in Carthage and then populated the edges of the Mediterranean islands. You've got the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths who come into Rome, with the Visigoths eventually settling in Spain. The Huns came in and took various areas around the Mediterranean as well, leaving the Franks to take Gaul, which would eventually become named for them as France, and the Angles, together with the Saxons, to take what we now call England, named also after them, the Angle land. That was them. They came in and took all of the empire, basically, all these various tribes. Now, you might have thought this was a terrible blow for Christianity. I mean, they'd just been God had handed them the empire on a plate and then whisked it away from them. And it could look bad. But actually, remember that when Christianity became popular in Rome, it had spread beyond the borders. And actually many of these invading tribes were already Christians. The only problem being that most of them were Arian Christians. So they didn't, but basically Arians, they don't believe that Jesus is divine. That's to put it in simple terms. And so these people came in, they would call themselves Christians, but they didn't believe Jesus was divine. It's more really leaning in the direction of Jehovah's Witnesses. And so now the Roman Church has its work cut out to convert these newcomers to Catholic Christianity, which we'll call it from now on. Catholic simply meaning universal, real, genuine, universal Christianity, Catholic. What we see, though, as this power shift took place, is that just over 1 century of popularity has seen the church grow so powerful that it no longer needed the props of the Roman Empire in order to survive. You whip away the Roman power and all their authority structure, and the church stands. The big breakthrough, though, in converting these barbarians came in the late 5th century with the conversion of a guy called Clovis. He's on your thing as well. King of the Franks. He wasn't a Christian of any kind, just a pagan guy, but his wife was a Catholic Christianity. He had married her for political reasons. But eventually he joined her in her faith and was baptized. Now the Franks, they handled things a bit differently from the Romans and from ourselves. Basically, if you were a tribal leader, you didn't try to persuade your people to follow your religion by means of, convincing arguments and passionate exhortation. You told them which religion to follow, and if they refused, you killed them. Pretty straightforward. And so at Clovis's command, all of his people converted to Christianity and were baptized. And having accomplished this, he then began uniting the other German tribes as well, converting them as he did so at the point of the sword. And so the Catholic Church actually began to see these barbarians joining them. They took the lands back little by little. It's worth mentioning a few missionaries at this point. Just seemed a place to put them in. In the timeline, you'll see Patrick. I've put the missionaries kind of across the middle. You've got Patrick, who's a 4th century Englishman from Cumbria, who travelled to Ireland and founded Celtic Christianity. After Clovis's reign, there was a guy called Columbus. He was an Irishman who took a band of men called the Scots, and they went to take their Celtic Christianity to the Picts and renamed that land Scotland, which is what it's still called. And in the 8th century, Boniface, great name, another Englishman from Devon, he took the gospel across the Rhine into the lands where the barbarians had gone to make sure that these were all Catholics beyond the Rhine. I've included these guys because they all come from the British Isles. 2 Englishmen and an Irishman. It's like a little joke. Without a punchline. If you thought Britain was, simply some kind of backwater place full of pagans, the Druids sacrificing goats until William the Conqueror arrived, think again. Christianity came to our lands well before this. Back in 167 AD, this is in the midst of Roman persecution, the Bishop of Rome at that time, he sent missionaries to Britain at the request of one of the British kings. This is even before the popularity. A king in Britain said, "Can we have one of your Christian guys to come and convert our islands to Christianity, please?" Weird. And so actually very early on there was a strong Christian presence here, what became known, as I said, as Celtic Christianity. Now, they've gone. When those non-Christian Angles and Saxons invaded, what it did was it pushed the Celtic Christians back into Wales, into Ireland and into Cornwall. Hence there's still kind of division between them and the mainland in a sense, isn't there, Sean? Yeah. And in fact, they didn't even want to speak to these invaders. They made no attempt to convert them to Christianity whatsoever. They just simply ignored each other. What happened there? Oh, yes. Basically, it came back down to the Bishop of Rome again to sort out this situation. So a guy called Pope Gregory I, he's a guy famous for this saying, seeing these people from England and saying not angles, but angels. Obviously clever. And he sent Augustine, not to be confused with the other Augustine, to take the gospel to these Angles in 596. And he focused his attention on King Ethelbert. Great. And before long, this king was converted, and so too, therefore, all his subjects became converted as well. And Augustine then set up the seat of Christianity in Ethelbert's capital city of Canterbury, and that still remains then as the head of the English church. And so what happened then was that this Catholic Christianity swept across England, and then started to cause issues with the Celtic Christians, whose practices, they differed somewhat. Obviously, really important stuff. So, for example, their monks, they cut their hair differently from the Roman monks. We can't be having that. We will have to put you to death unless we sort this out. And so to avoid all the bloodshed that such things would entail, they called together the Synod of Whitby in 663. And basically they ruled that Catholic Christianity is the way forward, and everyone said, yeah, right, we'll do some of that. And so that was agreed upon. And so the British Isles are now sorted out, and they're all Catholic Christians. Done. So, as we move then into the 8th century, things are looking up for Christianity. It had survived the Germanic invasions. It had survived the fall of the Roman Empire. It had survived the struggle with Arian Christianity. But in the East, trouble was a-brewing. A new evil was rising up. Back in the early 7th century, in the early 600s, while Europe was still kind of settling down, while Arians were being run over and the Frankish tribes were uniting Gaul, a young man in Mecca, near the Red Sea in Arabia, was looking for religion, and his name was Muhammad. Now, he tried Judaism and Christianity, but found that neither lived up to what they promised. You see, the Christians in his hometown professed to care for the poor and needy and to live godly lives, but the reality that he saw was that they were worldly, lazy, given over to the worst of sins, and it proved to Muhammad that their gospel was worthless. Now, had they been a better example, maybe things would have turned out much differently. And it's always a wake-up call when I think of this, that had the people in that one local church actually been living out what are meant to be Christians, Islam might never have come to happened. Who knows who watches us today? But Muhammad, he was sickened by what he saw, and he retreated to a cave, and there he claimed that he received a message from the angel Gabriel, that it was recited to him, and so he wrote it down. It was about the one true God, or Allah, as the word for God is in Arabic, so he wrote all this down in a book that he called The Recitation, which is the word Quran, and he said, this isn't a new religion, this is the culmination of Judaism and the teaching of Jesus. He then founded the first Muslim community, and by the time he died in 632, most of Arabia had been converted. Now, he was something of a warrior leader. Remember, most of Christianity is full of warrior leaders as well. So he's just another warrior leader. And it's no surprise then when his successors turned militant with their Muslim message. And they took it to Syria by means of a vast army. Here's a map showing their conquests. And it's a bit long and thin. So basically they start down in Mecca, is there. Okay, and Medina, and they spread out from here. They had massive armies. These caliphs. Basically, by 638, they'd taken Jerusalem, where they eventually built the Dome of Rock on Temple Mount. By 651, the Persian Empire, that's to the right there, had fallen to them, an empire that Rome never seemed to be able to take. In 695, Carthage fell to them, a major Christian centre. By 711, they had taken all of the land from India to North Africa, defeating the Vandals, of course, who settled there recently. And in 720, they crossed over the Straits of Gibraltar, I think it is, defeating the Visigoths and taking Spain. So there's this huge area of land that they'd taken, and they turned it from Christianity to Islam. And it looked as though they were now going to move north and take the rest of Western Europe. But they hadn't reckoned on the good old Catholic Christian Franks. Now, by this time, Clovis, you remember, he's the king from earlier, his tribe had another king, obviously, this is a few hundred years later, and his name was Charles, and he was a great warrior and general. So great that he had earned himself the name Martel, which means the hammer. And in 732, that as the Muslims advanced, he gathered up his armies and went out to meet them at the very pivotal Battle of Tours. And true to his name, Charles the Hammer Martel smashed the invading army and ejected them from Gaul, thus stopping the advance of Islam into northern Europe for over 1,000 years. And it's generally reckoned that this is one of the most decisive battles of medieval Europe. Had Charles been defeated, it is hard to imagine anything stemming the flow of Islam from flooding into the West. So they were kind of kept as they were on that map, really. And but the spread of Islam, it did change a few things. It left the Western Church cut off now from the East. They'd taken lands between the two. And even though, as I said, they'd fallen out a bit, actually this was a great blow to Christianity. They also cut off the trade routes, and it shifted the balance of power as well. Before, the Western Empire was in a kind of long and thin sort of shape, with Rome at the dead centre. But now, as the Muslims had taken this land, it shifted into a more sort of northeast type of... jam the button and see if it's this more sort of diagonal, really. But you'll see that now Rome is no longer central, but the kingdom of the Franks is now central to the Western Empire. Although it's not really Western Empire, it's really just the Western Church at this point. In 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charles Martel's grandson, also called Charles, not merely as king of the Franks, but now as the new emperor of the West. And this Charles became known as Charles the Great, or as we know him, Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor. And this event was doubly important because it increased the power of the Pope. And that's what we're going to focus on for a bit, the power of the Pope, as we come to our end. You see, it was the Pope who had crowned Charlemagne. And so now, in addition to all the other authority that had been claimed by the papacy before this point, now the Pope suddenly has the authority to make emperors. The implications of this were enormous. Suddenly everybody wanted to be the Pope, and this is going to prove to be a problem. For his part, Charlemagne just kind of works on enlarging his empire. He's spreading his rule in pretty much every direction. At the end of the sword, especially north into Europe, into what we call Denmark, Norway, that kind of area. And the tribes there, they had a choice. Either die or go through the waters of baptism. And so thousands were baptized, thousands were killed, but thousands were also baptized by force, probably in rivers of blood now in Charlemagne. Nowadays, obviously, we'd probably consider this such evangelism techniques maybe somewhat questionable. I mean, is this forced conversion really valid? But the amazing thing is that it seems to have convinced the people being forced that this was what they now believed. And they actually began to, they actually really went at it with all their heart, because what they believed was that their pagan gods forsook them the moment they went through baptism. And so now they had only one God to turn to, being the God of Christianity. Lucky for them, that's the real God. So, not content with mere secular authority, though, Charlemagne took it upon himself to start appointing bishops as he saw fit, and even tried to reform the monasteries. Remember, by this time, they'd become rich, they'd become lazy, and They did that all the time. The secular interference then, like we saw earlier with Christianity becoming popular, this secular interference proved to be a major point of contention between emperors and popes. Now, after Charlemagne, there were a stream of weak kings, including his lazy and inept grandson, the very aptly named Charles the Fat. Brilliant name. And by the end of the 9th century, the Carolingian Empire, the Emperor of Charles's, just began to crumble and fall apart. This situation was made worse by Vikings invading from the north, and since Islam had cut off the trade routes to the east, what now happened was that the circulation of money in the west pretty much ground to a halt, and money became worthless. And land now became the only thing that really had any value. This is the feudal. See, you've all heard of the feudal systems of the 9th to 15th centuries. This is where this all begins. Everything grinds to a halt. Now, the thing is that the people who had all the land were the churches and the monasteries. So these bishops and abbots are suddenly massively influential, enormously wealthy, and everyone wants to be abbots and bishops now, as well as wanting to be the Pope, including an awful lot of people who have very little interest in the church and just a lot of interest in themselves. And so there's this increasing moral decline that happens. You'll see the 10th century basically just says decline. Very little really happening there. I think there was, there's a brief ray of hope you've got in there in 909. The great Abbey at Cluny was built as a centre for monastic reform. They were going to return them to the Benedictine rule, and they spread out these Cluniac monasteries. The only problem being that within literally just a couple of generations, the Cluniac monks ended up being even richer than the other monks, and ended up being even more corrupt than those they were trying to reform. As for the Pope, the power of the papacy, as I said, it started to cause major problems. Nicholas I, we've got 3 popes on there, 4 actually. Nicholas I, Pope at the end of the 9th century, he made use of what are called the false decretals. These are forged documents. They claimed ownership of the Vatican. It's not really owned by the Roman Church. It exalted the position of the Pope, and Nicholas used these to gain more power. And then after him, one pope after another was poisoned, stabbed, bludgeoned to death, or assassinated some other. I mean, some of them lasted hours, not even days and weeks. Not very papal behaviour, you might think. And there's plenty worse still to come. I haven't got much more to come, but it's worse anyway. In the early 11th century, Pope Leo IX, he decided to sort out that division that they got between the East and the West. He wanted to kind of make amends, you know, sorry we disagreed at the Council of Chalcedon, let's get this sorted out. And so he sent a representative to discuss a few proposals with the Patriarch of Constantinople, the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And it very quickly degenerated into a brawl in which everyone excommunicated everyone else. So it was right, that's it, you're excommunicated. So, no, you're excommunicated. I excommunicated you first. But I'm the real church, so only you can't excommunicate. I excommunicate all your church as well. I excommunicate all your church. And it just ended up like that. And so the result is basically the Great Schism of 1054. And this point, the East and West are completely separate. From this point, we definitely can speak of Roman Catholic Church, Eastern Orthodox Church, or the Greek Orthodox Church, and never to darken each other's doorways again. To get our historical bearings just quickly, this is a mere 12 years before the Battle of Hastings, where I used to think that's where history began. So, I mean, this is still quite a long time ago here. And just 7 years after that, Gregory VII became Pope, and he elevated the power of the papacy pretty well as far as it could go. In 1075, he produced the Dictatus Papae. I'm just going to read you a few quick statements from this to give you a little flavour of what it had to say. Only the Bishop of Rome has the right to be called universal Catholic. Correct. He alone can depose and reinstate bishops, so the Emperor can't do that anymore. Only the feet of the Pope shall be kissed by all princes. His name alone should be spoken in the churches, and this is the only name in the world. The Pope's judgment may be retracted by no one, and he himself cannot be judged. And the Roman Church has never erred, nor will it err throughout eternity. Those are just a few of the choice statements found in the Dictatus Papal. And as you can imagine, the emperor at the time, he wasn't massively thrilled by this document, and he threatened to remove Gregory from the papacy. And so in response, of course, Gregory excommunicated him, and he resolved all of the emperor's subjects from having to obey him or do their duty by him whatsoever. And in the end, this meant that the emperor was forced to walk barefoot across the Alps to make his way to Italy, where Gregory made him wait outside in the snow, barefooted, wearing sackcloth, for 3 days before he allowed him to come in and then removed his excommunication. I mean, this is papal power gone mad. And you can see why so many people wanted to be Mr. Pope. Now, possibly the worst abuse of papal power were the Crusades. And we ended 1095. Pope Urban II decided he wanted to have a little go, a little shot at those Muslims, push them back a bit, maybe unite the East and West churches. Let's give that a go. And in part, the First Crusade was successful. They did recapture Jerusalem. They wiped out massive amounts of Muslims and Jews, because they were there as well. But they failed to keep hold of that prize. And so there were a further 7 crusades which followed this over the next couple of centuries, and they were nothing more than atrocities. Thousands went at the Pope's command to fight what he called a holy war. Participation guaranteed, according to the Pope, forgiveness of your sins and those of your loved ones. And so Jerusalem was captured and recaptured and captured again. And at one point, when they failed to capture it on one occasion, they went off to the Eastern Church and attacked them instead, just because they were cross, it would appear. So that, any hope of reconciliation gone. And worst of all, though, absolutely the worst. We've got to the lowest point of the church, really, at this point. And from here, we're going to go up, but not today. The lowest point was the Children's Crusade. You don't hear about it. It's not listed among the Crusades. It's there, though. The Children's Crusade, where 30,000 children were sent to the Holy Lands to fight, because the Pope believed that their purity would keep them safe and ensure their victory, and guaranteed their families absolution of all their sins if their children went to war. And of course, what happened was that before they even got close to Jerusalem, the Muslims wiped them out without a single casualty. And so while we're ending this session on something of a low note, be sure that there was a lot of good that has been happening during this period of history, these few hundred years. The church had influenced society for the better in many different ways. A fundamental doctrine had been worked out and agreed upon. The canon of Scripture had been agreed upon and set. And the gospel had spread, and many, many thousands of people had been saved. You know, all the bad things, really, that happened during this time are not as a result of the gospel, but a result of corruption due to power, popularity, and prosperity. And it shows us again the potential for massive evil and corruption when anyone, Christians or not, get hold of these sorts of things, this sort of power. And reminds us of the potential power that we have in control over people, that we have to always guard ourselves against. Next time, we will see the clamber up from these depths, and how God then began to prepare his church for the reform it so greatly needed.